So to every one of you here, and to those following the stream, a very warm welcome. So, let's get started. Our first topic today is the last topic Mari mentioned, work-life balance. So, what are the sources of the gender gap in wages and careers among academics in Sweden and Norway? To answer that question, please welcome Associate Professor at Mälardalen University, Karin Halldén, and researcher for work and welfare at the Institute for Social Research in Oslo, Kjersti Mische Østbakken. Varsågod.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Karin, and this is Kjersti, and we're going to hold this presentation jointly. So, the title of today's presentation is Exploring the Sources of the Gender Pay Gap Among Academics in Sweden and Norway. And across time, there has been a steady increase in the number of female PhD holders in the Western world. However, the research on the pay development among this group is fairly scarce. So what we do in this paper is that we examine the sources on the gender pay gap in Sweden and Norway among PhDs, and we compare PhDs inside and outside academia, as well as those that are parents to those that are non-parents. And we're going to present some of the pieces of results today. We have a lot more, so if there is any specific topics that you're interested in that is not presented in the slides today, please just ask us after the presentation. We might have done some runs on that. Okay, so why is it of interest to study the gender pay gap among PhDs? So one might argue that this is a particularly compelling case to compare female and male PhD students, since these have invested vastly in human capital, and they tend to be highly work committed and specialized. So those two accounts would actually tend to point to the fact that the gender pay gap would be smaller compared to the overall gender pay gap in the labor market, because men and women are assumed to be more similar in terms of human capital investments and work commitment. However, on the other side, there's also evidence that the skill depreciation, human capital depreciation, is larger in highly skilled occupations, such as being a PhD and working with such job tasks. And that would imply that it might be wider gender pay gap among PhDs. So those are some of the rationales why it's interesting to compare female and male PhDs in terms of pay. We here present results for Norway and Sweden, and why is it interesting to study these two countries? And one reason for that is that Sweden and Norway and the other Nordic countries tend to be internationally famous for very high levels of gender equality, and is year after year rated very high on different reports as regard gender equality. So the data that we used in this project it's quantitative data, and we used administrative registers both from Sweden and from Norway. They tend to share a lot, they have a lot in common. There are also some differences. So we harmonized as the best we could do, and we choose a sample that consists of employed PhDs. They were employed in 2017. So we study this year, and they are between 25 to 65 years of age. 25 to 65 years of age. So the main variables, since we study the pay gap, we have an indicator of pay. It's yearly gross earnings, so it's labor earnings without any social transfers, and we have logged this variable. It's a continuous variable. And the main independent variables are if you're working in academia or not, and gender. Then we have some control variables, and we divided them up into individual characteristics, age and immigrant status, and then educational characteristics, which is mainly field of study, so what kind of discipline you tend to be within. Then we have the other group, which is family characteristics. And here we have adjusted for marital status, if you are married or not, also in a registered partnership, as well as the number of children. And finally, we have job characteristics, and that includes time since PhD graduation. Then we have some specific control variables that we apply for those that work in academia, and some specific that are applied for those that work outside academia. So for those PhDs that are working inside academia, we adjust for academic rank by adjusting for if you are professor or not. And for those working outside academia, we adjust for industry, quite detailed industry variables, as well as occupation. Right, so if we would move on to start with some descriptives, what we see here, it's the red pieces of the pie is women, whereas the greenish pieces of the pie are men. It's for Sweden on the, left from your side, and Norway to the right from your side. And then it's inside and outside academia. So inside academia is the lighter fields, and the darker fields are outside academia. And what we might see here that it's quite interesting is that first of all, it is gender balanced among PhDs. There is also a larger fraction that works outside academia among both men and women. Another thing that is quite interesting, I find, is that the Norwegian and Swedish figures are fairly similar, and you will see that coming too, which is kind of gives us confidence that this is actually valid, our results. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Kjersti. Yes.
Thank you. And now over to the results. Yes, let's see. So based on the data, we have calculated the gender pay gaps within and outside academia in Norway and Sweden. And we present it here as a kind of ratio of 100 kroner. So what you see here is that in Sweden, inside academia, women on average earn 89 kroners, Swedish kroners, per 100 kroners a male PhD earn. And then you see that in Norway it's so the ratio is very similar. When we go outside academia, the gender pay gap widens. And what really stands out here is that the pay gap outside academia in Norway is fairly large compared to Sweden, as we see. When we do these calculations, we include sort of everyone with a PhD, and as you saw, we have access to information on the field of study and also the age and the immigrant status and of these individuals, and among other things, these are also things that can sort of influence the wage levels. So if there are any group differences between men and women with PhDs in these sectors, these might actually lead to some of the pay gap that we see. So when we control for these differences in what we call observable characteristics, we see that the pay difference decreases, right? So there are some differences between the groups of men and women that actually influence the wages that we saw previously. And when we control for them, to put it easily, we compare fairly similar men and women. We see that the pay gap is smaller, but still, it is a difference. In Sweden, inside academia, women earn comparable equally women to men earn 95 kroner per 100 kroner. So there is still a wage or a pay gap for fairly similar male and female PhDs. We also see that these differences in characteristics between men and women influence the pay gap outside academia in Norway quite much. So when we go into the details and we try to sort of decompose or break down the differences, we find that there are some clear explanations, and then there's some parts that are unexplained to us because they're not observable to us and they're not included in the models we use. And we see that differences in these observable characteristics accounts for up to 50% of the observed gender pay gap, meaning that there are some, to us, unobservable factors that are also driving these differences. We do this in fair detail in the analysis, and what we see is that gender differences in individual characteristics and family characteristics, the ones that Karin presented previously, account for a very little share. It's hardly any, it explains hardly anything of the pay gap. What really stands out as a clear explanation is gender segregation. And this is also one of the main explanations when we look at the labor market overall, and not only among academics. So these are sort of structures and patterns that we also see inside and outside academia. Okay. So we were also talking about like work-life balance, and also during the child-rearing years, we know that the gender pay gap is commonly sort of intensified due to sort of increased childcare responsibilities, for instance, and also having parental leave and influences sort of the human capital of both women and men, but mostly among women. So that's sort of a hypothesis, is that having children would probably affect women's wages more than men's. But we also know that among highly educated men, they commonly take on more of the care responsibility. So we were a bit...
Compared to other men.
Compared to other men, yeah, thanks. So, sort of this makes it really interesting also to compare sort of the role of children for men's wages. So when we do that, we see that, first of all, we see that having children gives a motherhood penalty on wages for highly educated women inside academia. And for Norway, there seems to be hardly any difference between fathers and men without children. There's a small premium actually for some of the groups, but what really stands out is in Sweden, inside academia, men with young children also face a parenthood penalty. And then when we also do this for those working outside academia with perhaps other logics in work, we see that the motherhood penalty is larger in that sector, but the pattern of these men in Sweden that also face a wage penalty to being parents remains. And this is a really interesting feature that we are also eager to investigate further on in future analysis, because we are curious. What is it with this Swedish man? Are there some differences in the family policies across those countries who are fairly equal in many respects? So this is something that we will hope to pursue in the future. So we now presented some of the results, and now we want to sort of just bring out some of the possible mechanisms that could drive the results that we see. So what we think of firstly is that the career breaks might sort of drive some of these patterns, that deterioration of human capital and productivity might be stronger for women because they have longer parental leaves, for instance. We also know that having a family sort of puts some time constraints in the household, and it's fairly common to have some sort of household specialization. This might affect men and women differently. Having a partner at home taking care of things that needs to be taken care of can also help the other partner to intensify their effort in the labor market. We also think of selection. There might be some selection by the individual that makes some types of PhDs work inside or outside academia, or that there are some kind of preferences towards the work situation when you raise children.
That are gendered.
That are gendered, definitely. And we also think that there might be some employer discrimination. There could be employers that are sort of unwelcoming toward parents and the needs that they face in certain sort of phases of their child-rearing responsibilities.
Yes, I think that is all that we had to present.
So thank you so much, Kjersti and Karin. We are now going to just move to Sigtuna, who's going to talk about some of the processes and reasons why certain academics take their degrees and migrate to other sectors, for instance, the corporate world. So please welcome Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Social Research in Oslo, Sigtuna, Hallerinjo.
First, PhD holders embrace many privileges linked to self-realization and autonomy. And PhD careers, both inside and outside of academia, offers exciting and meaningful jobs and opportunities. Still, during recent years, research have been concerned with processes of precarization in academia, in terms of more fixed-term employment and more uncertainty and competition. Based on these changes, scholars argue that in a time when the opportunities for stable employment in academia are decreasing, promoting gender equality raises new challenges. And here we use the concept of precariousness as a framework to empirically investigate degrees and dimensions of risk, exposure, and instability at work, and how it relates to work-family ideals and actually work-family dynamics. Studies of US academics show how the cost of flexibility stigma leads to avoidance, delaying, or hiding of motherhood. And despite these strategies, US mothers in academia experience that the very notion of pregnancy and motherhood mark them as violating the schema of total work devotion. But in contrast to this, in our Nordic setting, our informants do not talk of avoiding, delaying, or hiding parenthood. Instead, both men and women actually embrace the idea and the high value of having it all. A satisfying and challenging career, but also an involved and gender-equal family life, probably reflecting our Nordic welfare system. But despite all that, our respondents with family obligations still talk about precarious dilemmas related to what we call the flexibility paradox. course, flexibility is a privilege, and most of the respondents celebrate the flexibility to work where and whenever they want, and especially the freedom in PhD and postdoc positions. Still, there is also precariousness, and especially for postdocs. While a PhD is seen to open doors both inside and outside, as we saw in the former presentation, it's a risk linked to this postdoc, because the specialization is seen as making it harder to get a job outside if you do not win the permanent position inside. And here, the relevant component is important. And this might be some of the things that's not possible to control for in registered data. While both men and women recognize the privilege of almost always being able to step up for family needs, the short-term experience of privilege flexibility may also inhabit long-term trade-offs and costs if being the flexible one in the family means that there is always less time to meet the important deadlines and thus less time to invest in the excessive and increasingly more international competition. Among our respondents, actually not being the flexible one in the family is listed as a privilege in competitive careers, both inside and outside of academia. The traditional critique of the ideal worker model emphasizes lack of flexibility in organization, making it harder for mothers. But we argue that it may be more fruitful to nuance the picture and study academic careers as portfolio careers. And what do we mean by that? Portfolio workers operate as independent actors, investing in their own portfolio of projects, even when employed by organizations. And in this type of individualistic careers, inflexible organizations and old-fashioned employers may not be the main challenge. But the personal portfolio worker norm requires ongoing investments as workers see their career as an asset they invest in. And here, the risk and responsibilities are shifting from organizations to workers. PhD holders in highly competitive positions, both inside and outside of academia, may operate more closely to this norm than to the norm of an ordinary employee in a family-friendly society. And our data show how this norm may lead to precariousness among involved parents, not due to the flexibility stigma, but due to uneven conditions for productivity. And in academia, the pressure to invest the extra time may lead to challenging work-family trade-offs. An assistant professor explains, it's the last and extra effort that you put into proposals, projects, and publications, which can lift them to the required level of excellence. And if you do not have the opportunity to invest the last 20% extra, then the 80% you have already invested may amount to little. But it's not only negative. The race in individualistic portfolio careers provides a rush of intensity, excitement, meaning, and endorsement. But still, portfolio careers requires the ability to constantly sell yourself based on recent performance. And this requirement implies a risk of precariousness in the form of strong individual competition and potential demanding work-family trade-offs. And our informants explains how the competition in academia has become more international. In some fields, they talk about that 50% or even more of the newly recruited faculty for permanent positions are from abroad. And it's explained that the Norwegians have a little trouble reaching up. having a smaller, weaker international profile, being a bit older, and having a family. It's just how it is. She describes how the increased focus of fast upward trajectories may especially harm women during the family building phase, even when the parental leave is accounted for, as it's not only the actual leave that matters. When Norwegian mothers compete with academics who instead of compete with people who instead of building a family actually still invest in enormous big production, then they don't match up. And she describes how the Institute tried to take children and family life into consideration in employment decisions. But still, the foreigners with impressive CVs and often without children win, as a slower upward trajectory among Norwegian mothers is often interpreted as, okay, you kind of stagnated then. So, what do they do? Nearing the end here now. Inside of academia, the precariousness seems highest during the first 10 to 15 years of the career. With fixed-term jobs, low wages, and harsh work environment. But then the precariousness decreases if you get the permanent job. In a permanent position inside, our informants describe how it is possible to settle for good enough and enjoy the privilege of work-family balance as long as the international competition for research money is not too extreme. Outside of academia, the timeline might be different. Here, our informants in highly competitive careers talk about privileges early in the career in terms of better wages and a permanent job that actually makes it possible to get a loan, buy a home. And they also talk a lot about the great work environment, working together and actually feeling appreciated instead of just being criticized. And the impact of having a real say. Still, over time, the permanent position may not be that permanent when the company reorganizes or restructure. The fear of becoming redundant is present in highly competitive personal portfolio careers, typically found in the well-paid private sector. Although privileged in terms of impact, meaning, status, and income, the feeling of precariousness in terms of insecurity may increase with age as the race intensified and the company earnings are required to increase. Nevertheless, in our sample, we also find PhD holders in jobs outside of academia who escape the precariousness of personal portfolio careers and live privileged lives with the room for involved family life and high job satisfaction, meaning and security. These PhD holders have actually permanent jobs and are not facing the pressure of extreme individual competition. Thus, they experience that they have the opportunity to actually realize the widely common shared ideal of a privileged life, including both involved parenthood and an involved family life. To conclude, the ideal of a privileged life is clearly to combine involved academic careers with involved and gender-equal parenthood. Still, as long as the competition is so individualized and increasingly international and fixed on speedy progression, Nordic mothers and increasingly some fathers may experience the precariousness of portfolio careers, meaning that they navigate to other jobs and organizations, offering a better possibility for a privileged work and family life, which may maybe explain part of the picture shown for the wage differences outside shown earlier. So then the question is, can and will academia compete with other jobs, offering better possibilities for a privileged and sustainable work and family life? Thank you.
Varsågod, Anna.
So, should I stay or should I go? Well, so I believe this is a question that many academics ask themselves at some point. And in international research, there is this widespread claim that women opt out of academia due to the family-unfriendly work demands that Sigtuna just talked about. Now this is a kind of, I think, simplistic idea and seems rather traditional from a gender point of view to assume that women who have invested in a PhD degree, which is truly a strong investment, as they were saying, would still always put family first. And especially, you can wonder if that would really be true in the Nordic context. So I wanted to study people's deliberations behind the decision to stay or leave, and especially then if it was related to women opting out due to care responsibilities. So I interviewed 32 PhDs, half women, half men, and half stayers and half leavers. And these people were also matched across 8 disciplines in STEM and social science. So I had male and female stayers and leavers from the same discipline. So the idea of this was to sort of compare them under more similar circumstances. And when I... Okay, so when I analyzed these interviews, I found that the respondents could be divided into 4 groups. So strategic stayers, strategic leavers, accidental stayers, and accidental leavers. And the strategic stayers, they were really determined to make an academic career, and they applied these long-term strategies to achieve these goals. Whereas the strategic leavers, they were from the start aiming for a career outside academia, and so the PhD as a means to this end. And then the accidental stayers, they were sort of planning to leave or were hesitant about staying, and yet they ended up in academia. While the accidental leavers then were hoping to stay but ended up leaving. And for these accidental groups, of course, this was not the result of long-term strategy then. This was more like a decision made at a certain point in time, like a situational response. So I will look a bit further into these groups, and starting with the main contrast, the strategic stayers and leavers. And then for the strategic stayers, the main goal was this strong drive to sort of influence science and society through their own ideas and intellectual endeavors, like Niklas here says, to make an imprint. And that's why they chose academia. And the next theme I call embracing flexibility. Now, this refers to the unregulated work conditions that Sigtuna just talked about. And the strategic stayers, they really praised this autonomy, and they saw research as a passion and lifestyle rather than a job. And they tended to see themselves not as employees, but as entrepreneurs. And then the other sides, potentially drawbacks on this flexibility, like long hours, were just seen as part of the package. Like Oscar says here, that when you have done 60 hours a week for 3 weeks and the kids are ill, you may have a minor breakdown. But it's about being this person who's drawn to creative problems. So, and then as a contrast, the strategic leavers were not talking about this kind of individualistic imprint, but rather they wanted to be part of a collective effort to make a contribution to society. And also regarding this flexibility, they were very critical. And they saw this as an insecurity and unpredictability of temporary jobs and the need to constantly apply for funding and compete over resources as very discouraging. And also several of the women, like Frida here, was discouraged to see senior female researchers struggling. So she says they were always very stressed about having too little time for their families and too little time for their work, and they never felt adequate. It was disheartening. And so these groups, quite naturally, then also differed in strategies. So the strategic stayers, they did see this employment insecurity. They saw, for example, like Niklas here, he saw that people tended to get stuck in temporary positions with heavy teaching loads and little time for research. And they implied these massive strategies to avoid that and to secure, to get a secure foothold. So, for example, this person and others, he already from the start of the PhD education, he did this. For example, he decided to do 6 articles instead of the required 4 for his PhD, and he started building these international networks. He went abroad for guest research visits, and this was quite typical for all the strategic stayers that as soon as they could, they started applying for funding, for later funding, and then after the PhD, they could all move on to international postdocs or get these long-term projects even with career tracks. And then a second strategy that was what I call limiting family interference, and that was specifically for the women in this group. They were very concerned with this because they saw and experienced and foresaw these difficulties. Like Olivia said, with my first child, I was home for 5 months, and I noticed that you get counted out pretty soon. So with the second child, she stayed home only, I think it was 1 or 2 months. And others, they tried to control the timing of the children in a smart way, but especially they all negotiated these sort of strategic partner contracts with their spouses or partners, so that the partners, which were all men, by the way, in this case, took the majority of the parental leave and the general household work and so on, but also in, I think, 2 cases at least, the partner resigned their jobs or took all the parental leave to come with them abroad on postdocs and take care of the children when they had small children. So for me, so we can discuss this later, but in a way this turned out to be sort of very untraditional results. So that was sort of gender equality in one sense, but it's also kind of extreme if you consider that you also want to have children. But for the men, this was not really, this was a problem because the men also did not like to have this traditional division at home. It gave them different kinds of problems. But they didn't have to do a lot of strategizing and negotiating because this situation was, more naturally at hand. But I thought it was interesting to see that how much the academic career required was like a family project that required an adaptable partner. So, of course, the people that were single, for example, had some problems. Anyway, the strategic levers for them getting the PhD was the strategy, because they saw this as a means to getting a more qualified jobs outside, which they all did in this sample. Nobody worked at McDonald's. And also they saw it as sort of making room for family. So, okay, this might sound a bit idealistic, but the attitude towards family is more humane in industry. But this person and also several men emphasized that outside you could take parental leaves, you could use policy rights. Like in Sweden, we have the right to go down on part-time when we are parents, and also sick leave and so on, and that they would be able to use that outside. So, okay, just finally, this accidental groups. So they were, like I said, they had competing motives or were not sure what to do or opted for one sphere and did not in the other. And then where they actually ended up was like a result of a situational response to opportunities or obstacles at a crucial point in time, especially around the PhD and a few years after. But the processes looked a bit different then. So for the strategic stayers, I call it like being pulled in. And this person, Jörgen, had a kind of success story in that sense because he was an economist, and so he was offered this huge grant from like a bank without even applying for a project application, and then just, okay, so he stayed. But there were also others that had more, that didn't have any external job offers, and they accepted these temporary jobs for teaching and so on, and just kept staying. And in several of these cases, they were still after 8 to 10 years in a very precarious situation, and still with this question: should I stay or should I go? You know? And here, family was not really a reason why they stayed, but in the cases where they had small children, it was kind of problematic with this precarious situation that they got into. Like, for one person said that they had decided to share equally the parental leave, but in the end, he had to enroll, relatives, and all people couldn't take the parental leave because of the insecure employment situation. And then for the leavers then, they were sort of found themselves without employment, and some of them, like this person, Eva, really experienced this, like falling into this black hole. She really thought she would be able to stay on projects, but then it was all over, and she felt that, it had been a waste of time, basically, with all her investments. And another person had been staying on teaching assignments for like 5 years and felt really integrated into the department, but then there was like a change of management or cut downs, and then she was let go. But she felt afterwards, rationalizing, said, well, it was just as well, because what would have happened if I had stayed on even longer? So that was kind of depressive story, but others also, it was very clear in many cases that this was related, exits were related to family. And for example, this person, David, so he was in a similar situation, but he could have stayed on for like a short-term project, but he felt that it was too insecure economically when they were starting a family. That was a common story, but also many people mentioned also the possibility to take parental leaves, and I think this was interesting because this was also the men, like this person, Fredrik, said that it's old-fashioned to assume this only applies to women. I also, wanted a job outside because I wanted to be able to use parental leaves and so on. So that was the story, and in conclusion, I think that the family unfriendliness of academia in this case appeared mainly then in the women in academic careers foreseeing difficulties and really doing everything to limit family interference with work, which also means then limiting their own engagement in family. But I didn't go into this so much, but you could also see that academic careers clashed with the ideals that men had of involved fatherhood and gender equality. They didn't also like this extremely traditional division of work. But then I also saw, in contrast to this hypothesis that I talked about in the beginning, that family reasons were central to exits for women and men. So it was not just a question, not a question of women opting out. So what we see here is like not a traditional story, but rather sort of new dilemmas that relate to these ideals that we have, especially in the Nordics, about dual earner families and gender equality ideals. And I think this is interesting because the Nordic policies, I mean, they were constructed to give women a right to work, but also a right to care, right, with parental leaves and so on. And I think this is also provides new dilemmas for societies, because also you can really see that long-term strategies are kind of uncertain in academia, but also many of these exits seem like they were made early on, a very radical decision, because none of them thought they would be able to come back to academia afterwards. So you can question, I think, is this really the best use of resources? That do we get the most people that are most fitted for research to stay in academia with these kind of work conditions? So, thank you.